She didn't scream when she saw them together. That's the part nobody understands. Amara Bennett, a woman who had buried 2 miscarriages, swallowed 1,000 silences, and built herself into the unbreakable queen of the most feared empire on the eastern seaboard, stood in that hallway and felt something worse than rage. She felt nothing. And sometimes, nothing is the most dangerous thing a woman can feel. If you're new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because this story goes places that will leave you breathless. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this journey has traveled. And if you've ever trusted someone who didn't deserve it, like this video, you already know what's coming. Let's begin. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. It came in sideways off the Atlantic, the kind of rain that didn't care about umbrellas or expensive coats, or the fact that you were standing on the terrace of a $12 million estate watching it destroy the rose garden your husband planted the year he first told you he loved you. Amara stood there anyway, barefoot on cold marble, 10 weeks pregnant and too exhausted to pretend the cold didn't reach her bones. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach. Not dramatically, not the way women did it in movies, just quietly, the way you press your hand against something fragile you're terrified of losing. The wind shifted, and she went inside. The Romano estate at night was a different creature than the one that greeted guests during the day. In daylight, it was architecture. Soaring ceilings, gallery walls, staff moving through corridors with the practiced invisibility of people paid well to disappear. But at night, with the storm pressing against the windows and the security lights casting long yellow stripes across the marble floors, the house breathed differently, heavier, like it was keeping secrets along with everyone else who lived inside it. Amara had learned to navigate it by sound, the creak on the 3rd step of the east staircase, the hum of the HVAC system that kicked on every night at 11. The particular silence of the East Wing when Adrian's bodyguards were stationed at the main entrance instead of the interior hallways, which meant he was working late, which meant she could walk without being watched. She'd learned all of it. 2 years of careful study, the way you learn the geography of a country you weren't born in. Because that's what this marriage had been in the end. Immigration into someone else's world. And Amara Bennett had never been the kind of woman who stumbled across unfamiliar terrain. She was thirsty. That was the whole reason she was up. The pregnancy had turned her body into something she barely recognized. The relentless nausea that ambushed her at random hours, the strange heat that radiated from her chest at 2 in the morning, the thirst that no amount of water seemed to satisfy. Her doctor had smiled warmly and said it was normal. Amara had smiled back and said nothing about the night she lay awake calculating exactly how much of her life had quietly slipped outside her control. The kitchen was on the ground floor, west side. She took the back staircase because the main hall felt too exposed this time of night, and she was still in the oversized sleep shirt she'd worn to bed. Adrian's old shirt, actually, from some charity event years before the wedding, faded blue with a small tear along the left shoulder seam. She'd kept it. She wasn't sure why anymore. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the laugh. She stopped walking. It wasn't a loud laugh. That was the thing. It was soft, easy. The kind of laugh that only comes out when someone feels completely, utterly comfortable in their surroundings. The kind of laugh that doesn't perform for anyone because it doesn't need to. Amara knew that laugh. She'd grown up beside that laugh. She'd heard it across kitchen tables and in the back seats of old cars and through apartment walls. She'd heard it at their mother's bedside in the hospital, and she'd heard it at their mother's grave 2 days later, breaking into something ragged and torn. She had known that laugh for 29 years. It was Selena. Amara's feet moved without her permission. That's the only way she could describe it later, in the quiet hours when she replayed the sequence compulsively, searching for the moment she could have turned back. Her feet simply carried her down the corridor toward the half-open door of Adrian's private office. The room she was technically permitted to enter, but had always felt was never entirely hers. The door was open 3 inches, maybe 4. Enough for the warm amber light to spill into the dark hallway, enough for sound to travel clearly. She looked. She saw Selena first. Her younger sister was sitting on the edge of Adrian's desk, her posture relaxed and unhurried, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a robe, a deep burgundy silk robe that Amara recognized because she had worn it herself dozens of times. Adrian had bought it for her during their first anniversary trip, in a small boutique in Florence that smelled like cedar and old leather. He'd held it up against her and said the color looked like it had been made for her specifically. Selena was wearing it like she owned it. Adrian was standing at the window with his back partially turned. He was still dressed, dark slacks, the sleeves of his dress shirt pushed up to the elbows in that way he had when he'd been working for hours and forgotten to care about appearances. He was saying something in a low voice, and Selena was laughing again at whatever it was. And the scene in front of Amara was so ordinary, so settled, so utterly comfortable that it was worse than walking in on violence. Violence she could have understood. Violence would have made sense in the language of the world Adrian Voss occupied. This was something else. This was intimacy. Amara stood in the hallway for what felt like a full minute, but was probably closer to 8 seconds. Her hand was still pressed flat against her stomach. The baby was 10 weeks old and the size of a strawberry, according to the pamphlet her doctor had given her, and she was standing in a dark corridor in her dead mother's daughter's laughter, discovering that the two people she loved most in the world had constructed an entire reality she'd been living adjacent to without knowing it. She did not push the door open. She did not speak. She did not make a single sound. She turned around. She walked back up the corridor. She went upstairs, past the third step that creaked, into the bedroom. And she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time without moving. She never got the water. The morning arrived the way mornings always did in the Romano estate, with the sound of staff beginning their routines below, the distant clatter of the kitchen preparing breakfast, the mechanical precision of a household that ran itself regardless of what catastrophes occurred inside it. Amara showered. She dressed carefully. She chose the dark green wrap dress because the color was composed, and the cut didn't reveal the slight change in her silhouette that she'd been quietly managing for 3 weeks. She did her hair. She applied the minimal makeup she preferred, and she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment longer than usual. She looked exactly the same as she always had. That surprised her, faintly. She went downstairs and sat at the breakfast table and poured herself a glass of orange juice and waited. Adrian came in 7 minutes later. He was freshly showered, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, his dark hair slightly damp. He was the kind of man whose physical presence rearranged the energy in a room without him trying. Something in the way he occupied space, deliberate and unhurried, like a man who had never once been required to rush toward anything because everything had always come to him eventually. He sat across from her. He poured coffee. He looked up. "You sleep okay?" he asked. "Fine," Amara said. She held his gaze for exactly as long as normal, not longer, not shorter. She watched his face for a flicker of anything, guilt, awareness, the slight adjustment people make when they're managing a secret in close proximity to the person it concerns. She found nothing. His face was a wall she had spent 2 years learning to read, and this morning it told her nothing at all. "You should eat something more than juice," he said, nodding toward the spread of food on the table. "Doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said." A beat. He held his coffee cup and watched her. "You okay?" "Tired," she said. "The rain kept me up." He nodded, accepting this, and returned to his phone. She ate half a piece of toast and watched him work through messages with the focused efficiency that had always simultaneously drawn her in and locked her out. Adrian Voss operated in a frequency that most people couldn't access. She had believed, in the early years, that she was one of the rare few who could. She'd believed she had found the particular wavelength of the man beneath the reputation, the tired, careful, occasionally tender man who existed in the spaces between power and isolation. Now she sat across from him and wondered how much of that had been real, and how much had been a story she'd needed badly enough to construct for herself. She wondered if the baby would have his jaw. She wondered, sitting very still with the toast going cold in her hand, whether that thought would ever stop feeling like a wound. Selena arrived that afternoon. This was not unusual. Selena had been visiting the estate regularly for nearly a year, which at the time had seemed like a natural evolution. Amara's younger sister finally making peace with the life Amara had built, finally accepting Adrian after years of pointed skepticism. Amara had been quietly relieved. Selena had always been the more volatile of the two of them, the one who said the thing other people swallowed, the one who made scenes at family dinners and held grudges and loved with the kind of intensity that left marks. She arrived in a cream linen blazer and dark jeans, carrying the designer bag Amara had gifted her last Christmas, and she walked through the front entrance with the ease of someone who knew exactly where every camera was positioned without needing to check. Amara watched her from the upper landing. Selena smiled up at her, warm, sisterly, the smile Amara had trusted since childhood. "Hey, you," Selena called up. "You look tired. Have you been sleeping?" "Come up," Amara said. They sat in Amara's private sitting room with the door closed, tea on the table between them, the rain still going outside, relentless. Selena talked. She always talked. About the apartment she was thinking of moving to, about a friend's drama, about a television show she'd started watching. Her voice filled the room the way it always had, warm and textured and certain of its welcome. Amara listened to her and thought, how long? Not out loud. She had learned years ago in the particular school of surviving a world like Adrian's that the question you ask out loud is never the question that matters. You ask the question that creates an opening, and you wait, and you watch what walks through it. "How's the pregnancy treating you?" Selena asked, folding her legs beneath her on the settee. "Some nausea," Amara said, "getting better." "You should take ginger. Mom swore by ginger." "I remember." Selena reached over and patted her hand. The gesture was warm, automatic, the reflex of a sister. Amara let her do it. "You're going to be such a good mother," Selena said, and her eyes were bright, and her voice was soft, and Amara looked at her and thought about the burgundy robe and the easy laugh, and the way Adrian had stood at the window in his office at 2 a.m. and wondered for the first time in her life whether she had ever truly known her sister at all. "Thank you," Amara said. She smiled. She poured more tea. She changed the subject to something safe, and she watched Selena's hands, and she began paying the kind of attention she should have started paying months ago. 3 days later, Amara stood in the hallway outside the estate's private study. Not Adrian's office, but the secondary study used for administrative files. And she held a conversation she had not planned to have. It was with Marcus, Adrian's head of security. A large man, quiet-natured, who had worked for the Voss organization for 11 years and operated with the particular loyalty of someone who had seen enough to understand that neutrality was its own form of survival. She had asked him, in passing, about the East Wing cameras. Not aggressively, not with the urgency she felt coiled in her chest. She'd asked the way she asked about everything, from a position of calm, with the assumption of a right to the information. Marcus had paused, and in that pause, in the slight recalibration she saw move through his expression, Amara understood that he already knew something. "The cameras in the East Corridor," she said, "have they been working consistently?" "There were some adjustments last week," he said carefully. "Adjustments. Maintenance issue. Was handled." Amara nodded slowly. "Who authorized the maintenance?" Another pause. Smaller this time, controlled. "The request came from the house management system." "The automated system?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze professionally, giving away nothing else. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. She walked away knowing 2 things. The cameras in the East Corridor had been shut off, and Marcus knew why, and Marcus wasn't going to tell her, and Marcus had worked for Adrian for 11 years and would continue working for Adrian long after whatever happened next finished happening. She was alone in this. That night, lying in the dark beside Adrian, who slept beside her with the particular stillness of a man whose sleep was never truly peaceful, Amara cataloged what she knew and what she suspected and what she needed to find out. She thought about the charity gala scheduled for the end of the month, the one Adrian had told her to prepare for last week, attended by names she recognized from newspapers and other names she'd learned to recognize from the quiet education of being married into this world. She thought about the documents she'd noticed once, briefly, in Adrian's private office, files that he'd covered when she entered unexpectedly with the reflexive speed of someone whose privacy was a professional necessity. She'd said nothing. She'd always said nothing about what she noticed, because noticing everything and revealing nothing was how she had survived in this marriage. But surviving, she was beginning to understand, was no longer going to be enough. She pressed her hand to her stomach in the dark. The baby was real. The betrayal was real. The war she was apparently in the middle of, without having been told she'd entered it, was real. And Amara Bennett, who had come from nothing, who had built herself without a blueprint, who had loved a dangerous man and chosen to believe in the parts of him that others refused to see, was not a woman who waited for someone else to define the terms of her own survival. She stared at the ceiling. She began to plan. 2 weeks later, she found the phone. She hadn't been looking for it, which was the strange part, the part that would stay with her. She'd been at the charity gala, the massive, terrifying, glittering event held in a renovated waterfront building where the music was expensive and the conversations were in code, and everyone in the room understood that the surface of the evening had nothing to do with what was actually happening underneath it. She'd been standing near the East Bar, nursing a sparkling water while Adrian worked the room with the controlled precision of a man who treated social performance as a tactical operation when a man had approached her. Not aggressively. Not with the urgency of someone who had something to hide. He'd approached the way a dangerous man approaches when he doesn't need to hurry because he's already certain of the outcome. He was tall, lean, older than Adrian by maybe 10 years, dark suit, no tie, a face that had seen difficult things and reached a kind of accommodation with them. "Mrs. Voss," he said. Not a question. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't think we've been introduced." "We haven't," he said. "My name is Damien Vale." She kept her expression arranged. She knew the name. Adrian had mentioned it twice, always in the particular tone he used when discussing something that required careful handling. "Mr. Vale," she said. He didn't extend a hand. He simply stood beside her at the appropriate social distance, looking out at the room, and spoke in a voice low enough to be private without performing privacy. "You seem like a woman who pays attention," he said. "Most women do," she replied. A short sound from him that might have been appreciation. "The greatest danger," he said quietly, "doesn't always come from the people your husband considers enemies." She said nothing. She waited. "Sometimes it comes from family." He set his glass down. He turned to leave, and then he paused. "Enjoy your evening," he said. She felt something press against her palm. She didn't look down immediately. She waited until he had moved away, until she had turned back to the room and recalibrated her expression and taken a slow sip of sparkling water, and then she looked. It was a phone. Small, black, featureless, already unlocked, already open to a single text message. "Search Adrian's private office. Find the truth before they destroy you." Amara stood at the edge of the most dangerous party she had ever attended, with a dead man's warning in her hand and her sister's laugh still living in her memory, and a baby growing quietly inside her who had no idea what kind of world it was being born into. She closed her hand around the phone. She looked up. Across the room, Adrian was watching her. Not suspiciously, just watching, the way he sometimes did. That particular focused attention that she had once believed was love and now no longer knew how to name. She smiled at him. He smiled back, briefly, and returned to his conversation. Amara lowered her glass. The phone pressed warm against her palm. And for the first time since she'd stood in that dark corridor and watched her world come apart at the seams, she stopped waiting for the ground to stop moving beneath her feet and started thinking about what she was going to do with the map she'd just been handed. She didn't know yet what she would find in that office. She didn't know the depth of the war she was walking into, or who was already positioned on the other side of it, or how much had been decided about her life without anyone bothering to ask her opinion. But Damien Vale had called her a woman who pays attention. He had no idea yet exactly what that meant. She would go to the office 3 nights later, and what she found there would change everything she thought she understood about the man sleeping beside her, and about the danger already moving, quietly, toward the child she was carrying. 3 nights was a long time to carry a secret in a house full of people paid to notice things. Amara spent those 3 nights doing what she had always done best, appearing to be exactly what the people around her expected. She sat through a dinner with 2 of Adrian's senior associates and their wives, and she was gracious and warm and said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments. She attended a follow-up appointment with her obstetrician and listened carefully to everything the doctor said about iron levels and sleep and the particular vulnerability of the first trimester, and she thanked her and scheduled the next appointment and drove back to the estate in the back of the black SUV with her hands folded in her lap and her mind somewhere else entirely. She kept the small black phone in the lining pocket of a winter coat she hadn't worn since February. The coat was in the back of her walk-in closet, behind the organized rows of what her life looked like from the outside. She'd checked it once, the morning after the gala, just to confirm it was real and not something her exhausted, pregnant brain had manufactured. It was real. Search Adrian's private office. Find the truth before they destroy you. The word they was the part that stayed with her. Not he, not she. They. On the third night, Adrian flew to Boston for what he described as a 48-hour business matter. He kissed her forehead before he left, which was something he'd started doing during the pregnancy. This particular careful tenderness that she had once found moving and now couldn't evaluate clearly because she no longer trusted her own responses to him. His mouth was warm against her skin, and she stood very still and let him do it, and said, "Travel safe," and watched the convoy of black vehicles disappear down the estate driveway. Then she waited 2 hours. She waited until the night staff completed their 11 o'clock checks, and the house settled into its particular nocturnal rhythm. She waited until Marcus's overnight rotation positioned the security detail at the exterior perimeter rather than the interior halls. Then she went to the office. She didn't bring anything. No bag, no phone of her own, nothing that could be construed as preparation if anyone happened to see her. Just Amara in dark clothing, moving through the house she'd spent 2 years memorizing, through the corridor where the cameras had received their maintenance adjustments, to the door of the room where she had watched her life fracture at its foundations. The door was locked. She'd anticipated this. She used the secondary key she'd had made 8 months ago during a brief period when Adrian had asked her to manage a property insurance matter that required access to the filing cabinets. He'd never asked for the key back. She'd never volunteered it. The office at night was different without him in it. Smaller, somehow, and more ordinary. The desk that seemed to command the room when Adrian was behind it was just a desk. Dark wood, wide surface, the leather-bordered blotter precisely aligned the way he kept everything that was his. The bookshelves on the east wall held both real books and the filing infrastructure she'd noticed him reference during their first year together. The window where he'd stood with Selena showed nothing now but rain-streaked glass and the distant lights of the security perimeter. She started at the desk. She went through it methodically, the way her mind worked, not frantically, not with the ransacking urgency of someone in a panic, but with the focused patience of a woman who had taught herself that speed was less reliable than accuracy. She opened each drawer. She noted what was present. She moved nothing that didn't need to be moved. The surface drawers held the mundane infrastructure of power, correspondence, contracts, the high-end stationery he preferred, a secondary phone that she left untouched. The lower right drawer was locked with a separate mechanism, a combination model that she'd noticed once and filed away. She studied it for a moment, then sat back on her heels. She thought about the combination for 11 minutes before she tried it. She thought about what Adrian used for the codes that needed to be retrievable without being written down. She thought about dates that mattered to him, numbers that carried personal weight for a man who claimed to be unsentimental but kept a photograph in his wallet of his mother that he'd never once showed her, but that she'd seen when his wallet had fallen open on the kitchen counter 2 years ago. She tried his mother's birth year combined with the month of the accident. The drawer opened. Inside there were 3 folders. She lifted them out carefully and set them on the desk surface and opened the first one. She was 3 pages in when she had to stop and breathe. She'd understood, in the abstract way that comes with marrying into a world like this, that Adrian's empire involved things she wasn't meant to examine. She'd made a private accommodation with that reality early on, the kind of moral arithmetic that people perform when they love someone complicated. She'd known the shape of it without knowing the details. The details were different. The first folder documented what appeared to be a sustained campaign against a series of municipal contract processes across 4 northeastern states. The paperwork was meticulous. Dates, amounts, names of officials, confirmation codes that meant nothing to her but clearly meant something to whoever had assembled this record. The scope of it was larger than she'd imagined. Not in a cinematic way, not with the theatrical darkness of the crime narratives she'd seen her whole life. Just in a spreadsheet way, a property records way, a way that looked like legitimate business infrastructure until you understood what the infrastructure was built on. She closed the first folder. She opened the second. The second one was older. Some of the documents were physical copies of things that had originally been handwritten, retyped into cleaner form. She recognized some of the names from the first folder. This was the history of whatever the first folder was, recording the present tense of the lineage of how Adrian's empire had reached its current shape. There was a name that appeared repeatedly. Victor Voss. She knew the name vaguely from a comment Adrian had made early in their marriage about his father's family and the division of the business after his father's death. He'd said it in passing, in the way that people reference painful history they've long since put to rest. He'd used the past tense. She'd taken it at face value. Victor Voss appeared in the second folder in the past tense and in the present tense. He appeared as an opposing party in legal documents. He appeared in handwritten notes that she was fairly certain were in Adrian's own hand, the same compact, controlled script she'd seen on the notes. He left her sometimes on the kitchen counter. The notes in this folder were not warm. She turned to the third folder and stopped. The third folder was thinner than the others, 6 pages. The first page was a property transfer. The second was a financial record. The third was a photograph, taken at distance, grainy, the kind of image that comes from surveillance rather than documentation. It was a photograph of Selena. She was outside a building Amara didn't recognize, walking with a man Amara had never seen. The man was older, heavy-set, wearing a coat that looked expensive and outdated simultaneously. On the back of the photograph, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 3 items: a date, a location, and 2 words: second contact. Amara sat very still with the photograph in her hand. She heard the creak, the third step of the east staircase. She moved fast. She put the third folder back exactly as it had been. She put the first 2 folders back in the order she'd found them. She closed the drawer and heard the lock click. She was on her feet and 2 steps from the desk when the office door opened. It was not Adrian. Adrian was in Boston. It was Marcus. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. His expression went through something quickly. Surprise, then assessment, then the practice neutral that she recognized as the professional version of himself. He was in his security coordinator's coat, a radio clipped at his shoulder. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "I was looking for a file from the property insurance matter last year. I thought I remembered leaving a copy in here." She watched him process this. She watched him look at her and then at the desk and then back at her, running the math that people in his position ran automatically. "The insurance files would be in the administrative study," he said, "on the second floor." "You're right," she said. "I must have confused myself." She moved toward the door. He didn't step aside immediately, not blocking her, nothing as overt as blocking her, but not stepping aside. Just present, just there, with his bulk and his 11 years and his knowledge of things he would not tell her. "Is there something I can help you locate?" he said. "No," she said. "I'll look in the morning. Thank you, Marcus." He stepped aside. She walked back to her bedroom and sat on the bed in the dark, and her hands were shaking. Not badly, not the shaking of someone falling apart. The fine, controlled tremor of someone who had just done something that could not be undone and was now living on the other side of it. The photograph of Selena with an unknown man. Second contact. A date from 8 months ago. Adrian already knew. He came back from Boston on the second evening, and she watched him walk into the house with the particular attention of someone reading a text in a language they've spent years learning and are only now beginning to understand fluently. He was tired, genuinely tired, in the way that went past the performative exhaustion of a powerful man claiming a hard week. He moved through the entrance with less of the territorial authority he usually carried in his own spaces, and he set his phone on the foyer table and rolled his neck once, just once, in the brief, unguarded moment between stepping inside and remembering that someone was watching. She'd made dinner, or rather, she'd told the kitchen what to prepare and supervised the details, which amounted to the same thing in the Romano estate. She'd set the dining room the way he liked it, understated, the good silver, no staff hovering. He noticed. She watched him notice. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to," she said. They sat. They ate. She asked him about Boston with the curiosity of a woman interested in her husband's life, which she was, which had always been true, which complicated everything. He told her about the trip in broad terms. A property acquisition that had involved more attorneys than it should have, a dinner with a contact he described only as complicated, He was edited, the way he was always edited, and she listened to the shape of what he left out the way she always had. Victor Voss, she said. She said it in the middle of his sentence, which she'd timed. She watched his face. The pause was less than a second. She would have missed it a year ago. What about him? Adrian said. Someone mentioned his name at the gala, she said. I realized I don't know much about him. You mentioned him early on. Your father's brother? Adrian set his fork down with the careful precision of a man making a deliberate choice about how to handle the next 60 seconds. Half-brother, he said. They didn't have the same mother. Are you still in contact? No? Is he involved in Amara? His voice was level, not angry, precisely controlled, which was sometimes worse than anger. Why are you asking me about Victor? She held his gaze. Someone mentioned his name. I asked. That's all. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked his fork back up. Victor is someone from the past, he said. He has nothing to do with our life. She nodded. She accepted this. She returned to her food and shifted the conversation to something small and domestic, and she let him believe the subject was closed. She thought about the third folder, the photograph. The handwriting she'd decided on her walk back to the bedroom that night was not Adrian's. Somebody had put that photograph in Adrian's locked drawer. Either Adrian had put it there, or someone with access to that drawer had put it there, and Adrian hadn't found it yet. Neither option was comfortable. Selena came 4 days later. This time, Amara was ready. She received her sister in the front salon, a more formal room than the private sitting room upstairs, a choice she'd made deliberately, in which she watched Selena register and file away behind her bright smile. You're looking better, Selena said, setting down her bag. More color. I've been eating more, Amara said. Sit down. Selena sat. She arranged herself with the unconscious ease that had always been her particular quality, the way she occupied space like she'd been invited into it specifically, like the room had been waiting for her. She'd had that quality since they were children. Their mother had called it charm. Amara had called it appetite. I want to ask you something, Amara said. Okay, Selena said. Easy, open, the face of a woman with nothing to manage. How well do you know Adrian's business? A beat that was just slightly too brief to be natural. I mean, I know what you've told me, the general, the real estate holdings, the consulting work. She tilted her head. Why? Because you know things you shouldn't, Amara said. The room shifted. Selena's expression moved through something quickly, a flicker of calculation that lasted less than a second before warmth reasserted itself. What does that mean? Last month, when we were talking in the kitchen and you mentioned the Harborview acquisition before it was announced publicly, Amara's voice was steady, level. She was not raising it, and she was not going to raise it. I didn't say anything at the time because I thought I'd misremembered, but I checked. The Harborview deal wasn't public until 3 weeks after you mentioned it. Silence. Selena looked at her with an expression that was almost respect before it became something else. Amara, I'm not accusing you of anything right now, Amara said. I'm asking you how you knew. I must have overheard something when I was here. You know how these houses are. People talk, sound carries. Selena. Her name? Flat. Without decoration. Selena stopped talking. I need you to tell me the truth, Amara said. I'm not asking as the woman married to the man you're involved with. I'm asking as your sister. I'm asking you as someone who is 10 weeks pregnant and who needs to understand what is happening in this house. The word involved landed like she'd intended it to land. She watched it land. She watched Selena's chest rise with a breath she was trying not to make visible. It's not what you think, Selena said. Tell me what it is then. It was a mistake. It's over. It has been over since... I know it's over, Amar said. Adrian told me. She hadn't spoken to Adrian about it yet. She said it the way she said things she needed to be true to make the next thing happen. And she watched Selena process the information and recalibrate. Then you know everything, Selena said quietly. I know some things, Amara said. I need to know the rest. Selena looked at her hands. She had their mother's hands, the same long fingers, the same way of holding tension in the knuckles. Amara had always noticed this. She noticed it now and felt the particular grief of loving someone who was hurting you, and she set the grief aside because this was not the moment for it. "There's a man," Selena said. "I met him about a year ago. He approached me at an event. I thought it was just—" She stopped. "He knew who I was, who you were, who Adrian was." Another stop, harder this time. "He asked me to spend time at the estate, to pay attention to certain things. He said it would help you, that Adrian was dangerous, and he was trying to protect people who were close to Adrian from getting caught in what was coming." "What was his name?" Amara said. Selena looked up. Her eyes were wet, and her voice was steady, and Amara understood that her sister had been living with this for a year, and the relief of being asked directly was physical. "He said his name was Victor," Selena said. "Victor Voss." The air in the room changed. "He said he was Adrian's uncle," Selena said. "He said he was trying to prevent a war." "And you believed him?" "I believed—" Selena's voice cracked on this word and then recovered. "I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe I was doing something that would protect you, that Adrian was going to destroy everything, and Victor was the one person positioned to stop it, and I could—" She stopped again. Her jaw tightened. "I know how that sounds." "What did you tell him?" "Meeting schedules, names of people Adrian met with. I overheard things, and I repeated them." She looked directly at Amara now, without flinching, with the particular terrible honesty of someone who has decided the only remaining option is the truth. "About the pregnancy." "I told him about the pregnancy." The room went very quiet. Amara did not move. She did not change her expression. She sat with the fact of what her sister had just said and let it exist in the room between them without trying to manage it. "He asked you specifically about the pregnancy," Amara said. "He asked if Adrian had an heir coming." Selena's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said it was relevant to the legal succession matters surrounding the business. I thought—" "Stop," Amara said. Selena stopped. Amara stood up. She went to the window. Outside, 2 of the perimeter security team were crossing the east grounds in their usual rotation, and the afternoon light was doing something golden and indifferent across the manicured lawn, and the world outside the glass looked entirely normal. "My medical records," Amara said, still facing the window. "My prenatal files, my doctor's names and appointment schedules." She turned. "Did you give him those?" Selena's silence was the answer. "I need you to leave," Amara said. "Amara, I need you to take your bag and get into your car and go back to your apartment and stay there and not contact me until I tell you to." Her voice was not raised. It was not shaking. It was the voice of a woman standing at the edge of something vast and dark and choosing, deliberately, not to fall in. "Can you do that?" It was not a question. Selena picked up her bag. She stood. At the doorway, she stopped and turned back, and her face was wrecked in the way faces get when people understand the full size of what they've done. "I'm sorry," she said. Amara looked at her. "I know," she said. She waited until she heard the front door close. Then she pressed her back against the wall and put both hands flat against her stomach and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and deliberate, the way her doctor had shown her during a stress management conversation she'd thought at the time was routine. Victor Voss had her medical records, her doctor's names, her appointment schedule. The man who believed Adrian had stolen his empire. The man who had spent years, positioning his pieces. Her sister had been a piece. The baby was a target. She pushed off the wall. She needed to find Adrian. She needed to tell him enough to make him act without revealing the full extent of what she'd uncovered. Because until she understood which information was safe to surface and which would put her at greater risk, she needed to control the tempo of what he knew. She was halfway to the east corridor when Marcus appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking fast with his radio already in his hand, and the expression on his face was not the controlled professional neutral she was used to. It was something closer to alarm. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I need you to come with me. There's been an incident at the harbor warehouse." She looked at him. "What kind of incident?" "An explosion," he said. "Mr. Voss is being notified. He's already in transit back." He moved toward her with the particular urgency of a man whose job had just escalated beyond its usual parameters. I need to get you to the secure interior until we've assessed the perimeter. She didn't move immediately. She stood in the corridor and looked at Marcus and understood that the war had just stopped being theoretical. Marcus, she said, how long ago did you know this was coming? He looked at her. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, exactly, but its more complicated cousin. Ma'am, he said, we need to move. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she walked with him, and the house that had been her prison and her sanctuary and the site of every betrayal she'd survived locked down around her. And somewhere in transit between Boston and the coastline, Adrian Voss was racing toward a war that had been built in his own hallways, by a man with his father's blood, using a woman with Amara's mother's hands. And Amara walked through the tightening house with her child quiet inside her, thinking about the 3rd folder, the photograph, the 2 words on the back of it. Second contact. If Selena was the second contact, she thought, then somewhere there was a first. And the first one was already inside. The secure room was on the basement level, behind a door that looked like a wall panel until you knew where to press. Amara had known where to press for 14 months. She'd filed the information away the way she filed everything, quietly, without announcing she'd noticed. In the part of her mind she kept separate from the part that smiled at dinner parties and asked Adrian about his day and performed the daily labor of being the wife of a man like him. The room itself was functional rather than designed for comfort. Reinforced walls, filtered air system, a bank of security monitors along the north side showing feeds from 22 cameras positioned across the estate grounds. There was a small refrigerator, a first aid kit, a landline phone connected to a dedicated encrypted line. 2 chairs, a table. Marcus put her in the room at 4:17 in the afternoon and told her someone would be with her within the hour. The door sealed behind him with a sound like a bank vault. She sat in one of the chairs and watched the security monitors. The feed showed the estate perimeter in real time, guards repositioning in response to the warehouse incident, the main gate closing to vehicle traffic. 2 additional vehicles she didn't recognize pulling up to the service entrance with the particular unhurried speed of people who had been expecting to make this trip. She counted the cameras she could see and thought about the cameras she couldn't. The first contact was already inside. She was nearly certain of it. She thought about Marcus, his 11 years, his pauses, the way he'd appeared in the corridor within 3 minutes of Selena's departure, which meant he'd known Selena was there and had been monitoring their conversation, or monitoring Selena's movements, or both, and the only question was who he was monitoring for. She stood up and went to the landline and picked it up. The line was live. She set it back down without dialing. 40 minutes later, the door opened and Adrian walked in. He looked like the drive had been the kind that strips the performance off a man. His jacket was gone, his top button was open, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not fear. Adrian Voss didn't do fear the way other men did, but something adjacent to it. The animal awareness of a man who has just understood that the threat was closer than he'd calculated. He looked at her first, not at the monitors, not at the room, at her. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He crossed to the monitors and stood with his hands on the table surface, leaning forward, reading the feeds with the focused speed of someone fluent in the language of surveillance and threat assessment. "Warehouse is gone," he said. "Accelerant-based, professional." He straightened. "No casualties." The night crew had already left. "That's lucky," she said. "That's intentional." He turned to look at her. "Whoever did this didn't want bodies. They wanted a message." "What's the message?" "That they can reach me." He pulled out one of the chairs and sat, his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor for a moment in the way he did when he was assembling information. Then he looked up at her. "I need to tell you something." "I know about Victor," she said. The room went very still. Adrian looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something that was part calculation and part something older and less armored. He didn't ask how. She watched him decide not to ask how, which told her more than the answer would have. "How long?" he said. "The gala. Damien Vale warned me. Then I found the folder in your desk." No reaction to the desk, which meant he'd known she'd been in there or suspected it and had already decided what to do with that information. Victor is behind the warehouse, she said. Yes. He's been building this for how long? Adrian looked at his hands. The gesture was so uncharacteristic. Adrian Voss did not look at his hands. Adrian Voss looked at people in rooms and exits, that it landed on her with the weight of genuine confession. Since my father died, he said. 8 years. And you've known. I've known there was a threat. I didn't know the shape of it until recently. He stood back up, the brief moment of something human closing over again. Victor believes the empire should have passed to him when my father died. My father left it to me. Victor has spent 8 years convincing himself that makes me a thief. And Selena, she said. The word fell between them. Adrian met her eyes. I should have told you the moment I understood what she was. Yes, Amar said. You should have. I ended it before I knew who she was working for. When I found out... He stopped. When did you find out? 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. She counted back. 6 weeks ago, she had been sitting across from him at breakfast, and he had asked if she'd slept okay, and she had said fine, and the rain kept her up. 6 weeks of breakfasts and dinners, and his hand on her back at events, and his mouth careful against her forehead before Boston. 6 weeks, she said. I was trying to identify the full scope before I... 6 weeks ago, you found out that my sister was feeding information to the man trying to destroy you, she said, and you said nothing to me. I am carrying your child. My medical records are in Victor Voss's possession, my doctor's names, my appointment schedule. She watched his face. How long have you known about the medical records? The pause was 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for a man like Adrian Voss to pause. 4 days, he said. The number hit her somewhere below the sternum. She turned away from him. She faced the security monitors because they were something concrete to look at. The orderly grid of the estate's exterior, the guards moving in their new formations, the world outside continuing its business. I needed to neutralize the threat before I put you in a position where you'd make decisions about my own safety, she said. About my child's safety? Amar Shuts. Don't. The word was quiet, flat. Don't explain the strategy to me right now. I have spent 2 years learning to live in your world, and the thing you have never given me is the information I needed to protect myself. And I want you to understand that I am not angry about Selena. She turned back. I am angry about what you decided I didn't need to know. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man encountering something he'd underestimated and was only now measuring accurately. You're right, he said. I know, she said. They came out of the secure room 2 hours later into a house that had transformed itself in the interim. There were more people, faces she recognized as the senior tier of Adrian's organization, men and one woman who existed at the level where the distinction between security and command became academic. They'd gathered in the main strategy room on the ground floor, the one she'd been in twice before, and which had always felt like a room that was tolerating her presence rather than including her. She walked in with Adrian, and the room adjusted without quite acknowledging that it had. The woman was Elena Marsh, who managed the legal and structural architecture of Adrian's holdings, and who looked at Amara with the assessing eyes of someone who had been wondering for 2 years exactly how much Adrian's wife understood, and was now beginning to revise her estimate. There was a man named Reeves who ran Eastern Logistics, and a man called Halden, who Amara knew primarily as the source of the very expensive wine that appeared at estate events, and about whom she'd always sensed something unreliable in the way he took up space. Adrian stood at the head of the table and laid out what he knew in the terse, stripped-down language of someone briefing people who needed facts rather than narrative. The warehouse. Victor. The timeline of the escalation. Amara sat at the side of the table and watched faces. She watched Halden. He asked 3 questions during the briefing. The first 2 were reasonable operational questions. The third one was about the medical records. If Voss has personal files on the family, Halden said, with the precisely calibrated concern of someone performing concern, we need to know what specific information he has access to. The pregnancy is a vulnerability from a security standpoint. Appointments, hospitals, any predictable routines. Amara looked at him. Adrian said, that's being managed. Is it? Because the exposure there is significant. If someone wanted to use the pregnancy as leverage or as a Halden, Adrian said. One word. The word that closed conversations. Halden closed his mouth. He looked down at the table and then up again, and his expression was smooth and professional and concerned. And Amara thought about the photograph in the third folder, the one in the handwriting that wasn't Adrian's, and she thought about the words second contact, and she thought about the timeline. If Selena was the second contact brought in approximately a year ago, then someone had made first contact before Selena. Someone already positioned, already inside. She kept her face composed. She looked at the monitors on the briefing room wall, and she looked at Elena, and she looked at Reeves, and she looked at Halden, and she did the math quietly inside a face that showed nothing. She asked to be excused at the first natural break. She said she needed to rest, framing it in the language of the pregnancy that had been functioning as a kind of social currency in this house, something that made people move aside for her in corridors, soften their voices, make accommodations. She had found the currency useful even when she resented needing it. Adrian looked at her when she said it, a look that contained several things at once, the particular watchfulness of the last few hours, something that might have been protectiveness, and underneath both of those, the acknowledgement of a man who was beginning to understand that the woman he'd married had been operating at a level he hadn't fully seen. "Marcus will stay with you," he said. "That won't be necessary," she said. "Amara." She looked at him. Something passed between them in that look, complicated, unresolved, containing all the damage of the last weeks, as well as something older and more persistent that neither of them had words for in a room full of other people. "Fine," she said. She left Marcus in the hallway outside her suite and went into the bedroom and sat at the vanity table with the lights on low and thought about Halden. She thought about how he'd known about the medical records before Adrian had mentioned them specifically in the briefing. She thought about the wine and the way he occupied space, and the way certain people who were dangerous precisely because they had spent so long performing something warmer and more ordinary. She picked up her personal phone. She went to the notes application and typed without looking up. Halden. First contact? Confirm. How did he know about medical records before briefing mentioned them? She deleted the note. Then she sat and recreated it from memory in the way she'd trained herself to carry information. Not on any device, not written anywhere, just in the architecture of her own recall, which had always been better than people gave her credit for. At 11 that night, while Adrian was in another meeting she wasn't invited to, Amara went to Elena Marsh. She found her in the library, working through documents at the long table with the focused efficiency of someone who ate problems for their nutritional value. Elena looked up when Amara came in and didn't do the thing most people did in the estate, which was pretend they hadn't been paying attention. "I have a question," Amara said, sitting across from her without being invited, which was itself a statement. Elena set down her pen. "All right. How long has Halden been part of the organization?" Elena's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. A brief recalibration. 7 years, she said. He came from the Eastern Division when it consolidated under Adrian. And before the consolidation, who did he work for? Pause. Smaller than Marcus's pauses, better controlled but present. The Eastern Division had several stakeholders during the transition period, Elena said carefully. Including Victor Voss's holdings, Amara said. The room was quiet for a moment. That was a long time ago, Elena said. The transition was assessed and cleared. Adrian reviewed everyone who came through the consolidation. I'm sure he did, Amara said. And I'm sure Halden has been very careful for 7 years. Elena looked at her with something that was, for the first time, straightforwardly respectful. Why are you telling me this and not Adrian? Elena said. Because Adrian is making decisions about what I need to know, Amara said. I'm not sure the information flow in the other direction has the same filter problem. She stood. I could be wrong about Halden. But you don't think you are? No, Amara said. I don't. She left Elena with her documents and went back through the quieted house, Marcus falling in behind her at a respectful distance that was still close enough to constitute surveillance, and she thought about what she'd set in motion and what it would produce and how long she had before Victor Voss moved again. The answer to the last question came faster than she'd expected. She was in bed, not sleeping, at 1:15 in the morning when the power went out. Not just in her room, the full estate. The kind of outage that the emergency generators were designed to catch within 90 seconds. The kind of backup system that Adrian's security infrastructure was built around. The generators didn't come on. The backup system had been disabled. She was out of bed before the darkness had fully registered. She knew where she was in the room. She had always kept this knowledge somewhere automatic, the way you keep fire exits. And she moved to the closet for the small emergency flashlight she'd placed there 6 months ago during a period when she'd been cataloging all the things she'd prepared for without admitting to herself what she was preparing for. The flashlight came on. She dressed fast. She was reaching for the door when it opened from the outside. It was not Marcus. The man in the doorway was one she'd seen 3 times in the estate's peripheral spaces. Loading dock, service corridor, once at the edge of the gala crowd. He'd been staff. He'd been unremarkable. He'd been, she now understood, exactly as invisible as he'd intended to be. He was holding a phone, screen facing her. On the screen was a live video feed. It showed Selena seated in what appeared to be an unfamiliar room, her hands visible on the table in front of her, her face showing the particular controlled blankness of someone who has been told very clearly what happens if they don't remain controlled. Below the video feed, a text message. Come with him. Tell no one. Or your sister's choices become your sister's consequences. Amara looked at the man in the doorway. She looked at the phone. She looked at the message from Victor Voss, who had spent 8 years building toward this moment, who had used her sister as a weapon and her pregnancy as leverage, and had now apparently decided that subtlety had served its purpose. She thought about Adrian. She thought about the meeting he was in, down 3 floors in a house with no power and compromised security, with a man who had spent 7 years waiting for a night exactly like this one. She thought about Halden. She thought about her child. And she made a decision that the woman she'd been 3 months ago would not have been capable of making, not because she lacked the intelligence, but because she'd still believed that survival in this world was someone else's job. She lowered the flashlight. Tell me where we're going, she said. The man said nothing. He stepped back from the doorway and gestured, and Amara walked out of her room and into the dark corridor and did not look back, because looking back was for people who still believed someone behind them was coming to help. She moved forward, into the dark, into the trap, into the most dangerous thing she had ever done, not because she had no choice, but because she had finally, clearly understood that waiting for someone else to end this was the only choice she could no longer afford to make. The car was a black SUV with the rear windows blacked out, and a driver who hadn't looked at her once since she got in. Amara sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her flashlight gone. The man from the doorway had taken it at the vehicle. Politely, the way you take something from someone when you want them to understand that politeness is simply a more efficient form of control. The phone with the video feed of Selena had disappeared back into his pocket. He sat beside her in the rear seat with the particular stillness of someone who had done this many times and found nothing remarkable about it. She noted the direction through the blacked-out windows by feel and sound. The estate's long driveway had a distinctive rhythm. The slight grade on the first quarter mile, the curve at the stone gatehouse, the transition from private road to the coastal highway that she'd driven enough times to know by the way it changed the tire sound on the vehicle's undercarriage. They turned north on the highway. She counted minutes. 14 minutes north meant the old Castellan property. She'd heard it mentioned once in a conversation she wasn't supposed to have been close enough to hear, 6 months ago, when Reeves and Halden had been talking in the East Corridor about a facility acquisition that had stalled. She hadn't known then why she was cataloging it. She knew now. The vehicle slowed, turned onto gravel, stopped. She got out before the man beside her could reach for her arm, which was a small act of control but the only one available to her, and she took it. The building was a converted boat storage facility. Large, industrial, set back from the water with the particular ugliness of a structure built for function and never retrofitted for anything else. The exterior lights were on, which meant they had their own generator, which meant this location had been prepared in advance, and not recently. There were 2 men at the entrance who looked at her with the professional blankness of hired machinery and opened the door without speaking. Inside was larger than it looked from the outside. The storage bays had been cleared of their original purpose, and refitted into something that suggested prolonged use. Folding tables with equipment she didn't try to identify. A communication set up along the east wall, a cluster of monitors showing feeds from multiple locations, including what she recognized with a cold drop in her stomach as the interior of the Romano estate. The power was out in the estate feeds. The screen showed static edged dark. Halden was standing at the communications table. He looked at her when she walked in and had the particular expression of a man who has been preparing for a moment and finds the reality of it slightly different from the preparation. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Halden," she said. She looked around the room. 8 people, counting Halden and the 2 men from the entrance and the driver and the man who'd come to her room. Professionally deployed, occupying the space with the low-level alertness of people on an operation rather than a gathering. She was the only person in the room who wasn't positioned near something useful. "Where's my sister?" she said. Halden nodded toward the back of the facility. There was a door in the rear wall, closed. "She's fine," he said. Victor wanted her somewhere stable while the night resolved. "While the night resolved," she said. "That's a way to say it. Would you like to sit down?" No. He accepted this. He moved to one of the folding chairs and sat himself, crossing one leg over the other with the ease of a man who believed the situation was firmly under his management. "You're smarter than Adrian gave you credit for," he said. "He loves you, in his way, but he's always operated from the assumption that protecting you meant keeping you separate from reality. And Victor thinks differently." "Victor thinks you're an asset that's been wasted," Halden said. "A woman with your capabilities, your composure. You've been decorating a house for 2 years." She looked at him steadily. "What happens tonight, Halden?" He uncrossed his leg. The ease shifted slightly, so not into discomfort, but into something more operational. "The estate's security system is compromised. Adrian's senior team is isolated in the strategy room, which is where we needed them while Victor's people move through the outer infrastructure and secure the organizational documentation. By morning, the legal and financial architecture of the Voss holdings will have been restructured under new authorization. And Adrian, pause. "Victor wants a conversation," Halden said. "That's not what I asked." "That's the answer I have." She breathed in through her nose. The air in the facility smelled like salt water and machine oil and the kind of waiting that had been accumulated over weeks. She thought about the estate's strategy room, about Adrian surrounded by men he'd trusted for years, with one among them who'd been positioned by his father's brother since before the trust was established. She thought about Elena, who had been in the library when Amara left her, and who was smart enough to have done something with what Amara told her. She thought about Marcus. "I want to see my sister," she said. "Now," she said. "I walked out of that house voluntarily. I got in that car voluntarily. I'm standing in this building voluntarily. The voluntary part of this evening has conditions, and the first one is that I see Selena right now." Halden looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded at one of the men near the back door, who opened it and gestured. She walked through. The back room was smaller, a supervisor's office from the facility's working days, the desk still bolted to the floor, the window high on the wall and small and reinforced. Selena was sitting in the chair behind the desk, which struck Amara as almost absurdly mundane, like a person waiting for a job interview. Her hands were not restrained. There was a bottle of water on the desk in front of her. She looked up when Amara came in, and something in her face broke open and then immediately tried to close again. "I'm okay," Selena said, before Amara could speak. Her voice was steady in the particular way of someone who has been holding themselves very still for several hours. "I'm not hurt." Amara crossed to her. She put her hand on Selena's face, both hands, cupping her sister's jaw the way their mother used to do when they were children, and something had frightened them. She looked at her eyes, her throat, her wrists. "You're sure?" Amara said quietly. "I'm sure." Selena's hands came up and gripped Amara's wrists. "How did you... Why are you here? You shouldn't be here. They showed me a feed of you." Selena's expression collapsed into something raw. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't think Victor would..." "Stop," Amara said softly. "We're not doing that right now." She lowered her hands and held Selena's. "I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" "Yes." "When I leave this room, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't argue. Don't try to move. Don't give anyone a reason to change the way they're handling you. You understand? What are you going to do? What I should have started doing 3 months ago. She squeezed her sister's hands once, firmly. Stay still. She went back through the door. Halden was where she'd left him. The room had the same configuration. She walked to the center of it and stopped. I want to talk to Victor, she said. Halden's eyebrows moved slightly. Victor isn't here. Then get him here. She looked at the communication setup. You have a line to him. Use it. Tell him his nephew's wife would like a conversation. That's not... Tell him I have something he wants that isn't in the files he's taking from the estate. She held Halden's gaze without blinking. Tell him I have the names of Adrian's 3 undisclosed international accounts and the authorization architecture that allows them to function. Tell him I've held on to that information for 2 years as a personal contingency. Tell him if he wants it, he talks to me directly. She paused. In person. The room had gone very quiet. Halden looked at her with an expression she understood was recalibrating something significant. You're not negotiating for Adrian, he said slowly. I'm negotiating for my child, she said. Adrian can handle himself. My child cannot. She held the room's silence. Make the call. Halden made the call. She waited. She stood in the middle of the room and didn't sit and didn't pace and managed her breathing the way her body needed her to manage it. Slow, deliberate, below the threshold of visible effort. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to, the physiological reality of sustained adrenaline, and she placed one hand briefly against her stomach under the pretense of adjusting her jacket. Steady, she thought, not to herself, to the child. 40 minutes later, Victor Voss arrived. She'd built a picture of him from the documents, from Selena's description, from the photograph in the 3rd folder. The picture had suggested a man whose danger was architectural rather than physical, the kind of person who built systems rather than operated them directly. The reality was a man of about 65, heavy set in the way that used to be called powerful, and now just looked like someone who'd stopped caring about the maintenance of appearances. His face had the structural similarity to Adrian's that close family carries, the same jaw, the same set of the eyes, the same quality of occupying a room like he'd already assessed every exit. But where Adrian's version of that quality was controlled, Victor's had something corroded in it. The specific corrosion of a man who has spent 8 years marinating in grievance. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. You look like a woman who's been awake too long, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried. You look like a man who built 8 years of plans on the assumption that the people around Adrian Voss would always be less dangerous than Adrian Voss, she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. Sit, he said. I'll stand. He sat. He gestured at Halden, who moved to the communications table and became quietly occupied, which was the facility's version of privacy. The accounts, Victor said. When my child is safe, she said. When I have confirmation that the estate is intact, that Adrian is unharmed, and that Selena walks out of this building tonight. You're not in a position to set conditions. I'm the only person in this building who knows where the accounts are, she said, which makes me the only person in this building you genuinely need, which means I'm exactly in a position to set conditions. She looked at him. You've been running this for 8 years, Mr. Voss. You understand leverage. He studied her. The corrosion in his face shifted into something that was, briefly, respect. Adrian doesn't know about the accounts, Victor said. No. You've held information back from your own husband. I held information back from a man who held information back from me, she said. We're a very modern marriage. He made the sound again that almost became a laugh. She watched him process the situation from inside his own framework. 8 years of planning, a night that was moving according to his architecture, and now this variable that hadn't been in the design. The estate security, she said. Restore it. That's a show of good faith, she said. The documentation you're pulling from the estate infrastructure is 3 years out of date. Adrian restructured the financial holdings after the consolidation. Whatever Halden gave you access to tonight is a map to a territory that no longer exists. She watched his face. You know this. That's why you need the accounts. The silence in the room changed quality. Victor looked at Halden. Halden, to his credit, showed very little, but the very little he showed was enough. He didn't tell you, Amara said. He told you the files would give you full operational control. He didn't tell you that the operational structure was rebuilt 18 months ago and he doesn't have access to the new architecture. She let this settle. Halden has been working for you for 7 years. In that time, he's also been working for himself. The money you've been paying him has been going into the same kind of undisclosed accounts that you're sitting here trying to get from me. She was taking a risk. She knew she was taking a risk. She was building an edifice on a foundation made of inference, and the look on Halden's face when Adrian had shut down his line of questioning in the briefing, the look not of a loyal operator being corrected, but of a man recalculating. She watched Victor look at Halden. She watched Halden understand what was happening. "That's not," Halden started. "Shut up," Victor said. The room's energy shifted like a physical thing. 2 of the men near the wall moved almost imperceptibly, not toward Amara, toward Halden. "How do you know about his accounts?" Victor said to her. His voice had dropped. "I know because your nephew's wife has spent 2 years being invisible in a house full of people who say things in front of invisible women," she said. "Halden made a call 14 months ago from the east corridor of the estate. He said a name I didn't recognize then. I recognize it now. It's the name on the holding company that owns the unit in the building where Halden's accounts clear. Total fabrication. Complete, detailed, delivered without a tremor in her voice." She watched Victor Voss decide whether to believe her. She watched Halden watch Victor decide. And then everything happened very fast. Halden moved. Not toward her or toward the communications table, toward something she couldn't see from her angle. And the 2 men who'd been drifting toward him moved faster than she would have expected. And there was a collision of bodies that was less like violence and more like physics, like objects following their mass. And the sound it made was brutal and brief. She stepped back. Not running. She was not going to run. But creating distance from the table, moving toward the wall, keeping Victor in her sightline and the door to Selena's room in her peripheral. Victor hadn't moved from his chair. He was watching Halden being restrained with the expression of a man crossing something off a list. 7 years, he said, not to anyone in particular. Then he looked at Amara, and she understood in the specific clarity of that moment that removing Halden had not improved her position. Victor was not a man whose plans depended on any one piece. He'd spent 8 years without rushing. He would not be rushed now. "The accounts," he said. "My conditions," she said. "Your conditions," he said slowly, "assume that I believe you have what you say you have, and that I believe you're willing to destroy your husband's financial infrastructure to protect yourself." "Yes," she said. "I am." "That's not a wife protecting her family," he said. "That's a woman burning her own house down. That's a woman who understands that a house you burn yourself is a house no one else gets to burn for you," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face, a rapid sequence of things, calculation and surprise, and something that was very close to fury being managed at the last second before it became visible. He looked up at her. "Your husband," he said, "is at the gate. Not in Boston. Not isolated in the strategy room." At the gate of this facility, which meant Elena had done something with what Amara had told her, which meant the 4 hours since the power outage had not been 4 hours of successful operational control, which meant Victor Voss's night was coming apart at its foundations. She looked at him steadily. She made sure her face showed him nothing. "Restore my sister," she said. "Restore the estate. And I will sit in this room with you, and I will not contact Adrian, and you will have the time you need to reassess your position before he comes through that gate." Victor Voss looked at the woman standing in front of him, 10 weeks pregnant, no weapon, no phone, no backup she was certain of. And she looked back at him without flinching, and the room held its breath. And outside the facility, she could hear the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving on gravel with the unhurried speed of people who had already decided how the night was going to end and were simply arriving to confirm. The sound of gravel under tires was the most clarifying thing Amara had heard all night. Not because it meant rescue. She was careful not to let herself believe that. Adrian arriving at the gate of a facility controlled by his uncle in the dark after a night of compromised security and internal betrayal was not rescue. It was collision. And collisions at this velocity didn't produce winners. They produced survivors, and the margin between surviving and not was still very much in motion. Victor Voss knew this too. She could see him calculating it in real time. The phone still in his hand, his eyes moving between her and the door and the monitors on the east wall that now showed headlights at the facility perimeter. He was a man who had spent 8 years in careful preparation and was now watching his timeline compress from months to minutes, and the particular fury of that compression was moving through him in the way that dangerous things move through dangerous men. Not outward, not yet, but pressurizing. "How many?" he said to the man nearest the monitors. "4 vehicles," the man said. "6? No, 8 personnel, armed." Victor looked at Amara. She looked back at him and kept her breathing even, and thought about the child, and thought about Selena in the back room, and thought about the 9 seconds it would take her to reach that door if everything in the front of this facility suddenly became something she needed to be away from. "You called him," Victor said. "I don't have a phone," she said. "You know I don't have a phone." "Then how?" "Elena Marsh," she said. "I told her about Halden before the power went out. She's been with Adrian's organization for 9 years, and she is considerably more loyal than the people you recruited." She paused. "I didn't call anyone. I didn't need to. I just told the truth to the right person and let the information move the way information moves when it's true." Victor set his phone down on the table. The gesture was slow, deliberate, the way a man sets something down when he's making a decision about what his hands are going to do next. "The accounts," he said. "You made them up." "Yes," she said. The admission landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples move through the men positioned around the facility. A shift in attention, a recalibration, the specific energy change that happens when people understand that the architecture of the last hour has been built on a fabrication delivered by a pregnant woman with no backup and no weapon, and nothing but the capacity to make a dangerous man spend 40 minutes doubting his own people. Halden, restrained against the communications table, made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been coming from a man in his current position. Victor looked at her, and his face went through something that she would remember for a long time. Not anger, or not only anger, but something closer to recognition. The look of a man encountering something he had categorically failed to account for and was only now measuring at its actual size. "You bought time," he said. "Yes." "For what?" "For exactly this," she said. "For your plan to be in a position where you had to weigh what walking out of this building costs you against what staying in it costs you." Outside, she heard a voice through a loudspeaker. Adrian's voice, flattened by amplification but unmistakable in its particular register. The voice that stopped conversations in rooms before it fully arrived. "Victor." One word, through the wall and the amplification and the accumulated damage of the night. "Come out." Victor stood. He was still looking at Amara when he stood, and she held his gaze without stepping back, and for 3 full seconds the facility held a silence that felt structural, like the moment before weight-bearing things decide what they're going to do. "Your husband is going to destroy everything my brother built," Victor said. It was not an accusation. It had the quality of something he had said to himself so many times that it had become a kind of texture in his voice rather than a statement. "Your brother left it to Adrian," she said quietly. "That was his choice, not Adrian's." "My brother was wrong." "Maybe," she said. "But he was your brother. And what you built tonight on top of that grief is still yours to own." He looked at her for one more moment, then he walked toward the facility door. He didn't run. He didn't reach for anything or gesture to anyone. He simply walked, with the bearing of a man who had held a particular story about himself for 8 years and was now walking to the place where the story ended, and there was something in the straightness of his back that Amara could not fully bring herself to hate. She let him go. Then she went to the back room. Selena was standing when Amara opened the door. She'd heard the loudspeaker, heard the voices, heard the shift in the facility's atmosphere the way you hear a storm changing direction. "It's over," Selena said. "Come on," Amara said. She took her sister's hand and they walked through the facility together, past Halden, who wouldn't look at either of them, past the men who were now focused entirely on the situation at the door rather than on two women moving through the space, and out through a service exit on the south wall that Amara had identified when she first walked in, because identifying exits was something she had been doing for 2 years without ever naming it that. The night air outside was cold and salt-heavy, and the sound of the Atlantic was constant beneath everything, the tide indifferent to the specific human disaster being resolved 30 meters away. Amara stood in the dark outside the facility with her sister's hand in hers and breathed the cold air in slowly and let her body feel all the things she'd been managing since 1:15 in the morning. The fatigue, the fear she'd set aside and kept setting aside, the low ache in her back that had started 2 hours ago and that she was deliberately not evaluating yet. She pressed her free hand against her stomach. Still. The baby, impossibly, imperviously, was still. She exhaled. Around the front of the building, she heard voices. Adrian's people deploying, the sounds of a confrontation that was resolving into custody rather than violence, which meant Elena had communicated the parameters correctly, and Adrian had come with the intention of ending this rather than executing it. She stayed where she was. She kept Selena beside her, and she stood in the dark and she waited, because she had spent enough of the night in motion, and she needed, for 5 minutes, to simply be somewhere that was not a trap. The 5 minutes passed. Then Marcus appeared at the corner of the building. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the professional neutral, not the careful management, but something that sat in the neighborhood of relief and in a smaller neighborhood next to it that she thought might have been shame. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Marcus," she said. He came toward them. "Are you—" "I'm fine," she said. "Selena is fine. We need a vehicle, and we need to go back to the estate." "Mr. Voss wants—" "I know what Mr. Voss wants," she said. "Tell him I'm going back to the estate. Tell him I'll be there when he's done here." She looked at Marcus steadily. "And Marcus, you and I are going to have a conversation very soon about your 11 years and what they included." He held her gaze. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had expected this and had decided to meet it rather than avoid it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The estate at 4 in the morning looked like the aftermath of something. The extra vehicles still at the perimeter, the interior lights restored but burning with the artificial brightness of emergency power, staff moving through corridors with the careful efficiency of people performing normalcy over the scaffolding of a crisis. Amara walked through it, and people stepped aside, and she went to her suite and took Selena with her and sat her sister on the couch in the sitting room and got 2 glasses of water and sat down. They were quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that has texture. "I need to tell you something," Selena said finally. "I know most of it," Amara said. "Not this part." Selena turned her glass in her hands. "When Victor first approached me, before any of it, before I understood what he was actually doing, he told me Adrian was going to hurt you, not physically. He said Adrian had been using you, that the marriage was a strategic move to legitimize the organization, and that when he was done, he would discard you. He said you were too smart to see it because you were too close to it." She looked up. "And the worst part is I wanted to believe it, not because I thought it was true, because it was easier than believing that you had found something I hadn't, that you were happy in a way I couldn't see the path to." Her voice broke on the last sentence, and she didn't try to hide that it broke. "I let a man I didn't know tell me a story about your life, and I chose it over what I could see with my own eyes, because it served something in me that was already there." Amara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her sister, the long fingers around the glass, their mother's hands, and she felt the weight of all the grief the night had compressed into a portable size so she could carry it, and now was beginning at the edges to expand back to its actual dimensions. "I know," Amara said. "You're not going to forgive me tonight," Selena said. It wasn't a question. "No," Amara said. "Not tonight." Selena nodded. She pressed her lips together. "But you will." Amara looked at her for a long time. "You're my sister," she said. "That doesn't stop meaning what it means just because you made the worst decision of your life." She leaned forward and covered Selena's hand with hers. "But you're going to have to let me be angry first. And you're going to have to let the anger take as long as it takes." "Okay," Selena said. "Okay." They sat together until Selena fell asleep on the couch, which happened with the abruptness of a body that has been running on fear and is suddenly out of it. Amara covered her with a blanket from the closet. She stood over her sleeping sister for a moment with the particular feeling of loving someone you're furious at, the way those two things don't cancel each other out, but instead exist in the same space and make everything heavier and more real. She went to the window. The sky in the east was doing what it did in the hour before dawn, not lightening exactly, but losing density, the dark thinning at the edges. She heard the estate door. She heard the particular sound of Adrian's footstep in the corridor, the one she'd cataloged 2 years ago in the early days when everything about him was information she was gathering and hadn't yet begun loving. She heard him pause outside the sitting room door, and then she heard him move past it to the bedroom and stop. She went to the doorway. He was standing in the middle of the bedroom, still in his operational clothes from the night, dark jacket, the same dress shirt open at the collar, a cut along his left jaw she hadn't seen from the corridor that had bled and dried and been ignored. He looked like a man at the end of something that had taken a long time to finish. He looked at her. She leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms and looked back. "Victor," she said. "In custody," he said. "Transferred to people who will ensure he stays that way." "Halden." "Same." She nodded. The silence between them was different from the silences of the past months. Not managed, not performed, not the careful diplomatic silence of two people maintaining a version of themselves for each other. It was just silence, the thing that's left when there's nothing left to hide behind. "The cut," she said. He touched his jaw. "It's nothing." "Sit down," she said. "I'll get the kit." "Amara?" "Sit down, Adrian." He sat on the edge of the bed. She went to the bathroom and got the first aid kit and came back and sat beside him and opened the kit and worked on the cut with the focused quietness of someone doing something with their hands because their hands need something to do. The cut was about 2 inches, not deep enough for stitches, the kind that comes from something moving fast through dark space. She cleaned it. She applied closure strips. She was aware of his stillness beside her. The very particular stillness of Adrian Voss when he was letting something happen to him rather than controlling it. "I knew about Selena before I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told myself it was strategy, that I was protecting you by managing it before you knew. I know what you told yourself. I know you know." He was looking at the floor while she worked. "I've spent my whole life in a version of the world where information is currency and giving it away is weakness, and the fewer people who know a thing, the safer it is. I built every relationship I have inside that framework." A pause. "Including ours." She pressed the last closure strip and sat back and looked at him. "That framework almost got our child killed," she said. The words landed on him. She watched them land. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet and undefended in a way she hadn't heard it before. "It did." "I am not going to pretend that tonight resolved what's between us," she said, "because it didn't. The cut healed is not the same as the cut not having happened. I know. But I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "I walked into that facility tonight with no phone, no weapon, and no certainty that you were coming. I did it because it was the only move that protected our child. And I did it alone." She let that sentence exist for a moment. "I am capable of operating in your world, Adrian. I have been capable of it for 2 years. The decision to keep me outside of it was not protection. It was a failure of partnership. And if this, whatever this is that we're building, is going to survive past tonight, that has to change." He looked at her for a long time. There was something moving through his face that she hadn't cataloged before. Not the controlled calculation, not the careful warmth he deployed in domestic contexts, but something rawer and less managed. The face of a man confronting a version of himself he hadn't been required to see clearly before. "You outmaneuvered Victor Voss with nothing but what you know and how you think," he said. "Yes," she said. "My father's brother. who spent 8 years building toward tonight. Yes. And you did it in 4 hours. 3.5, she said. Something shifted in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something that lived in the same county as a smile but had more years on it and more damage and more accuracy. I've been protecting the wrong thing, he said. You've been protecting an idea of me, she said. Not me. He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, both hands in his lap, the hands of a man who had used them in ways she'd never asked about and he'd never offered, and they'd both decided was part of the arithmetic of this life. Then he looked up. I want to tell you things, he said. Not the operational things. The other things. The ones I've been keeping because I convinced myself you were safer not knowing. He paused. If you want them. She considered him. She considered the night and the cost of it and the weight in her back that she was going to have to address soon regardless of everything else. And she considered the things she'd seen in the third folder. The evidence of the children he'd quietly funded, the families he'd quietly protected, the parts of himself he'd spent years performing cruelty over the top of. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I need to sleep, and tomorrow we need to talk about Marcus. Marcus. He knew things he didn't tell you. We'll talk about why and what it means. She stood up. But not tonight. He stood when she stood, and she moved past him toward the bed, and he caught her hand, not gripping, just his hand around hers, the way you hold something you're aware of being careful with. She stopped. The baby, he said. Tonight was... He stopped. Started again. Are you... I'll call the doctor in the morning, she said. For now, I think she's all right. The pronoun arrived before she'd made a decision about it. She felt it land. The she. The first time she gendered the child out loud, something she hadn't meant to do for weeks yet, and she felt Adrian go very still beside her in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment. She, he said. I don't know, Amara said. She, he said again, quietly, like a man trying a word in a language he's just discovered he wants to learn. She let him hold her hand for another moment. Then she pulled back gently and got into bed and lay in the dark and listened to him move around to his side and settle beside her with the familiar geography of a man she knew and didn't entirely know and was going to have to decide, in the daylight and in the weeks and months that followed, what she was willing to build with. Marcus gave his full accounting 3 days later. He sat across from both of them in the secondary study, Amar's choice of room, which Adrian had noted without comment, and he laid out what he knew and when he'd known it in the careful chronological sequence of a man who had decided that the only remaining version of his integrity was honesty. He'd known about Selena 8 months ago. He'd reported it to Adrian, who had told him to monitor the situation and say nothing to Amara. He had followed that order. He had rationalized it. He had understood, somewhere in the latter months, that Victor was more present in the situation than either he or Adrian had initially assessed, and he had escalated his concern internally and been told again to hold. The night of the power outage, he had been locked out of the security system at the same time as the rest of the estate infrastructure, Halden's doing, prepared months in advance. He'd gone to Elena Marsh within 12 minutes. Elena had reached Adrian. The rest was the rest. Amara listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions, each of which Marcus answered completely. Then she looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Marcus for a long moment. You followed my directive over your own judgment, Adrian said, about my wife's safety. Yes, Marcus said. Don't do that again, Adrian said. Marcus looked at him, then he looked at Amara. Yes, sir, he said. Mrs. Voss, I'm sorry. I know, Amara said. I'll let you know when sorry has had enough time. He accepted this. He left the room with the bearing of a man who understood that he was still employed and still trusted at a reduced level, and that the work of earning back the rest was going to take longer than the accounting had taken. When the door closed, the room was quiet. The empire, Amara said, the parts of it that Victor was targeting, the documentation. The documentation is being rebuilt under the new architecture, Adrian said. Elena is overseeing it. Good. She looked at the window. Outside, the estate grounds were visible in the pale autumn light, the rose garden still recovering from the season's first serious storm. I want to be part of those conversations going forward. I know. Not adjacent to them. In them. I know, he said again. And this time the words carried something different. Not the managed acknowledgement of a man accepting a condition, but the simpler weight of a man who had arrived somewhere new and recognized it. She nodded. She didn't tell him that she'd found the children's medical files in the third folder, the documented quiet funding of treatments his organization had made possible without attaching a name to them. She didn't tell him yet because it was information she'd been holding, and she understood now how information held too long changes its nature, how the thing you keep private to protect someone eventually becomes the thing that separates you from them. She would tell him. Not that day, but soon. Because she had spent 2 years in a marriage that operated in the space between what was said and what was true, and she was not willing to spend the next 2 years in the same geography. 6 months later, the Romano estate looked like itself again. The additional security measures were less visible, but more comprehensive. A renovation Elena had overseen with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. The rose garden had been replanted in the spring by a gardener who'd asked Amara what she preferred and received, for the first time, a direct answer about what she actually wanted rather than a diplomatic version of what she thought was expected. Amara stood at the window of the upstairs sitting room in the early morning while the estate was still quiet and held her daughter. The baby was 11 days old and had the particular concentrated seriousness of a very new person who has not yet decided what the world is but is gathering information at an impressive rate. She had Adrian's jaw, as Amara had wondered in the very early days of knowing she was pregnant, and she had Amara's eyes, and she had her own hands, which were entirely her own, not their mother's, not their grandmother's. Something new. Selena had been there for the birth. She'd come in the morning, and she'd stayed through the afternoon, and when the baby arrived, she'd held Amara's hand with both of hers and wept in the unconstrained way that Selena wept, without managing it, and Amara had looked at her sister's face and felt the specific geography of forgiveness. Not the sudden clean sweep of it, but the slower version, the one that doesn't arrive as an event but accumulates like light through a window, present before you've named it. They were not yet where they had been. Amara wasn't sure they would return to exactly that place. Some things that fracture don't reassemble into their original shape. They reassemble into something that holds differently, that has different load-bearing points, that you learn to trust in a different way. She thought this was probably all right. The baby made a sound, not quite a complaint, not quite a question, something between the two. I know, Amara said softly. I'm still figuring it out too. She heard Adrian in the corridor. She'd learned his footstep again over the past months, re-cataloging it the way you relearn a language you'd learned imperfectly the first time. The same sounds, but a fuller understanding of what they meant. He stopped at the doorway. He was holding 2 coffees, and he looked like a man who had not slept entirely through the night, which was true of every night in the past 11 days, and which he had not once complained about. He looked at Amara. He looked at their daughter. He had an expression that she had no vocabulary for and didn't try to find one, because some things resist language, and that's the evidence that they're real. He came in. He set the coffees on the table and sat beside her on the window seat, close enough that his arm was against hers. They looked out at the estate in the morning light. The grounds, the gardens, the security perimeter that was present but no longer the loudest thing about the place. The Atlantic was visible at the far edge of the property, where the land dropped toward the coast, gray-green and enormous, and completely unconcerned with everything that had happened on this particular piece of land over the last months. Victor's hearing is next week, Adrian said. I know. You don't have to be there. I'm going, she said. He didn't argue. This too was new. Or not new, but acknowledged. The difference between a man who knew his wife was capable of something and a man who acted inside that knowledge. It required, she'd found, less drama than she'd expected. Mostly, it just required him saying fewer things that started with, you don't have to, and more things that started with, what do you think? They were working on it. The baby shifted in her arms, the small, concentrated weight of her, and Amara adjusted her hold and the baby resettled and went quiet again. Satisfied by the adjustment, And Amara thought about all the versions of this morning that hadn't happened. The versions where the night at the facility had resolved differently, where the fabrication hadn't held, where Elena hadn't reached Adrian, where the cost had been paid by someone small and new who had no part in any of it. She didn't stay long in those versions. She'd learned not to. The mind can marinate in the almost loss until it poisons the actual having, and she was not willing to let that happen. She leaned her head back against the window frame and looked at the water and the light and the grounds, and she thought about what she'd said in the facility. A house you burn yourself is a house no one else gets to burn for you. And she thought that might not have been entirely accurate. What she'd actually done was not burn anything. She'd stood in the middle of it and refused to be the accelerant. That was harder. It didn't make as clean a sentence. But the house was still standing, and the people she loved were in it. And Amara Bennett, who had come from nowhere particular and built herself into something that had no name for it yet, who had walked into a trap with nothing but the truth and a fabrication and the knowledge of her own mind, who had loved a complicated man and earned the right to be fully known by him, who had survived the particular violence of intimate betrayal and come out the other side still capable of sitting in a window in the morning holding her daughter, pressed her face briefly against the soft top of her child's head and breathed. The estate was quiet. The light was coming. The day was beginning, the way days do, with complete indifference to what the night before it had cost. And that, she thought, was exactly enough.